Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. With Prime Minister Trudeau's allegations linking agents of the Indian government to the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, which have created deep concern in major Western capitals dominating the news, we asked this evening, what more can Canada's journalists tell us about the Prime Minister's allegations, as well as about the close consultation and coordination between Ottawa and Washington over this issue? Joining me live from Ottawa is the senior parliamentary reporter of the Globe and Mail, Canada's premier newspaper, Stephen Chase. Stephen Chase, it's been reported that before Prime Minister Trudeau went public with his allegations against India, your paper, the Globe and Mail's bureau chief, Robert Fife, had given the government notice of his intention to publish an Indian story. So let me start by asking, is your India story the same as the one that the Prime Minister spoke about in the House of Commons?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. What we were going to publish and what we told the government was that we were going to publish that there was credible intelligence that India was behind the slaying of Mr. Nijjar.
In which case, from what you know of Robert Fife's story details, how good is the case that connects India to the killing of Hardeep Singh Nijjar?
And I should just say that it's both my story and Robert's story. We're both authors on it. The government has credible intelligence that leads it to believe that India was directly or indirectly behind the murder of Mr. Nijjar. The government was so confident about this that it had already told trade delegations that they should be ready for the cancellation and the postponement of an October trade mission, and they'd already signaled to their trade negotiators that they were going to pause or suspend trade talks. So by the time we'd reported it, the government had already been taking definitive steps reflecting what they knew.
And you believe that this is a sign of the government's confidence in the case they have?
Yes, it was going to come out eventually.
Now, interestingly, you talked about having credible intelligence. On the other hand, Prime Minister Trudeau, when he spoke in Parliament, phrased himself very carefully but significantly differently. He spoke about credible allegations. And people in India have picked up that credible allegations are not necessarily credible evidence. And he didn't use the other term you used, credible intelligence. So how do you interpret Trudeau's very careful choice of words? What exactly does it amount to?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can't really explain Mr. Trudeau's choice of words. He made them. But the very fact that he stood up in the House and made this bombshell accusation would indicate that he had sufficient intelligence to have the confidence to disrupt international relations to this extent. So regardless of the exact phrasing of Mr. Trudeau's words, the act itself of standing up in the House of Commons and accusing a partner, an ally, of serious wrongdoing should I think reflect that Mr. Trudeau had the confidence that he was proceeding with the appropriate intelligence and evidence. So I'm not really concerned about the difference in wording between him and us.
But the interesting thing, as the author of that article, and my apologies for not naming you earlier, I wasn't aware that you were a co-author as well. But the interesting thing, as one of the co-authors, you are repeatedly using the phrase credible intelligence rather than the phrase Trudeau used. You, as a journalist, are confident this is intelligence, not allegation.
Yes, and what we reported was that the government believes it has credible intelligence. So they are confident that this is sufficient information to undergird the incredible accusation they made in the House of Commons. They are not going on a whim here by standing up in the House and accusing India of doing this. So I don't really see the parsing is of the words, but the actions are what tells you what Mr. Trudeau believes.
And the important action is he stood up in Parliament, not at a press conference, not in a statement, but in the House of Commons to make that announcement.
Yeah, we've never done this in my career. I've never seen someone do this before for any ally.
And in fact, if he was wrong in what he was saying, he could presumably be done for misleading the House or even contempt of the House, which is why he would be very careful if he's going to say this in Parliament, that he's got his facts lined up behind him.
And also that he understands what would follow from that announcement. I mean, there's no question that the government was preparing to make this announcement. We beat them to the punch. They'd already told the trade delegation, forget it, you're not going. They'd already told their trade negotiators, we've been working on a trade deal with India on and off since 2010. They'd already told them India is supposed to be the Indo in our Indo-Pacific policy. We were supposed to be moving in a significant pivot towards India and other countries bordering the Indian Ocean as a way to reduce our reliance on China. So you see the consequences that flow from this action. And he knew that ahead of time. He's not stupid.
Now, there's a second element of what the Prime Minister said in the House of Commons that has been picked up. He spoke of, and I'm quoting him, a potential link between the agents of the government of India and the killing of a Canadian citizen, Hardeep Singh Nijjar. Once again, a potential link is not an established link, but only a suspected link or perhaps a possible link. Again, how do you interpret that word potential?
That's a good question. Again, it's funny because you're asking me to interpret his words. I think for me, it's the action of what he did more than the exact words he used. He has to provide, I think that part of the situation and where we are right now is the investigation is continuing. So he doesn't want to prejudice the investigation. So he wants to leave room open for the fact that the investigation is still continuing. People still need to be interviewed. People still need to be followed up on. So my impression is, and you could ask, we should ask the Prime Minister why he didn't wait until the investigation was finished. But I think that also reflects the fact that this process is still in the investigative stages. One of the things we were told is give us more time because the investigation continues.
When you say one of the things you were told, that is you and your colleague Robert Fife were told, hold up your article, we need more time before you go ahead with it.
Yes.
In that article, would you have called the intelligence you have a potential link, or would you have dropped the word potential?
We said that the government believes it has credible evidence that India is behind the slaying of Nijjar.
Your words are very important. I'm repeating it. You said you believe the government has credible evidence.
The government believes it has credible evidence.
Right. So, in fact, you were using the word evidence.
Credible intelligence.
Okay. Now, yesterday, Canada's ambassador to the United Nations, Bob Rae, told CBC News that Canada had used energetic, quiet diplomacy with the Modi government over the past few weeks. Separately, the New York Times has reported, and I'm sure your papers have reported this as well, that Jodie Thomas, your national security advisor, accompanied by heads of Canada's intelligence service, traveled to India, possibly on more than one occasion, to confront India's intelligence agencies. But literally 2 hours before you and I went live with this interview, Indian official spokespersons, a gentleman called Arindam Bagchi, has said publicly no specific information was given to us. So now we have two very contrasting versions coming up. So let me ask you, do you have any sense of what was said at those meetings that your national security advisor and the head of Canada's intelligence service had with Indian officials?
My sense is, and this took place in India in the context of the G20 meeting, that Mr. Trudeau shared the information with Mr. Biden and Mr. Modi, and that Ms. Thomas shared the information on, again, what they knew from the investigation. That's our sense of it at the moment.
You're saying two very important things.
Oh, and
Trudeau spoke to Biden at the G20.
Yes, Trudeau spoke to Biden, and Trudeau, the Canadian government, I'm not sure if it's Trudeau directly, spoke to Rishi Sunak as well.
And when they say, when I mean the Indian government says that no specific information was given, would you say specific information was given?
That's our understanding, yeah.
So from your point of view, what the Indian spokesman has said is inaccurate.
I'm at a loss to explain what the Indian spokesman is saying.
Now, Bob Rae also told CBC News yesterday, and I'm quoting him, "We didn't see much coming from the other side." Do you have any sense of what was the Indian response either to Jodie Thomas or to Mr. Trudeau himself?
No, I do not.
Now, Mr. Trudeau has made clear in Parliament that he did take up this matter with Mr. Modi at the G20, and his words were, "I did so in no uncertain terms." And it's widely known that that was a pretty frosty meeting, and one presumes this is one reason that meeting was so frosty. Have you been able to find out anything about how the Indian Prime Minister responded to Mr. Trudeau?
Not directly, but we understand that the Indian government's position before we published our article was that this is absurd. And one person familiar with the Indian government's position likened it to George Bush's claim that there was weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We published that in our first article. So there was absolute dismissal, absolute rejection of this. And of course, then that takes us back to the long-standing argument between India and Canada over Khalistani sympathizers. Canada tends to play it down as a free speech issue, and India considers it a serious terrorist threat.
But you have no specific leaks in Canada of what might have been the alleged response from Modi to Trudeau?
No.
Now, the American National Security Council spokesperson has said, and I'm quoting her, "We are coordinating and consulting with Canada closely on this issue." Do you in Canada have any sense of how close this coordination and consultation is?
We, from speaking to people in the security community and the government, we have a sense that India is an extremely important partner for the United States in its Indo-Pacific policy and its efforts to counter China. And so we think that this takes a definite backseat to any of United States' priorities. So we don't see a lot in terms of anything besides, and this is important, not challenging Canada's version of events, but we don't see our allies publicly condemning India for this. We see them issuing, support, sincere, lending credibility to the allegations, but not willing to take the step of joining Canada in condemning India.
Can I ask you this? The State Department has expressed deep concern. I believe the National Security Council spokesperson has also expressed deep concern. And I think both of them have said that they would like to see India cooperate with Canada on the investigation. But do you have any sense whether Washington endorses or verifies or takes more seriously the intelligence you have? Have they made any comment on the quality of the intelligence?
No, they haven't. They have simply not challenged our version of events publicly. Okay.
Now, your opposition leader, Pierre Poilievre, has said, and I'm quoting him, "The Prime Minister hasn't provided any facts. He only provided a statement we want to see more information. Do you, as a journalist, have any sense of when Prime Minister Trudeau will reveal further details and thus buttress the allegation he's made? Today, the Indian spokesperson made a point of saying not only that Canada has given us no specific information, but he also said all that has been spoken of is an allegation, there is no evidence. So do we have any sense when that evidence or the intelligence will be made available?
No, there's no sense of that. And Mr. Poilievre is making a very good point, which is if you're going to level these kind of accusations against the Indian government, you should back it up with facts.
Is there any sense of anxiety or maybe criticism in Canada that having made these serious allegations, the Prime Minister has kept quiet and not actually backed them up with evidence, and now at least 2 days have passed?
Oh, absolutely. I still don't understand where the Canadian government is going with this. I don't quite understand. However, there is a context for this, which is the Trudeau government has been sinking in the polls. They are a minority government. They could theoretically be defeated at any time. They are 6 or 7 or 8 points behind in the polls behind the Conservative Party. So there is a public inquiry that's about to launch on foreign interference in Canada, and the Trudeau government's record is going to be scrutinized and likely criticized, particularly, of course, with respect to China. This incident is certainly opportune for the Prime Minister on a number of fronts. It allows him to reconnect or re-energize his connections with Sikh voters in Canada, who are, I wouldn't say a voting bloc, but they are important. They can be very important for getting out the vote, for canvassing, and so on and so forth. But it also inoculates him or gives him a card to play when the public inquiry unfolds and people ask him, what did you do about foreign interference with China? And he can say, well, look what I did with India. So I don't know what the Prime Minister's endgame here is, but it comes at an opportune time for him domestically.
I definitely want to talk about some of the things you mentioned, but let me pick up, because I think it will be important for an Indian audience, 2 things you said. You said, I don't know where the Prime Minister is going with this story. And then later in that same answer, you said, we don't know what the Prime Minister's end game is. So in other words, am I right in assuming journalists and maybe commentators are asking questions about what exactly is Justin Trudeau up to? Why has he not backed this up? Why has he suddenly gone silent?
Yes, and if you think back to 2017, Mr. Trudeau's last trip to India, you get a sense as a journalist that the relationship is not top. The relationship with the Indian government is not top of mind. You feel that the relationship with the Indo-Canadian community is more important. So I often don't understand our Indian policy. We made a huge announcement last November, one of our first foreign policy statements we've seen from this government. In fact, the first foreign policy statement we'd seen in probably 17 years, the Indo-Pacific policy, a pivot away from China towards countries bordering the Indian Ocean and more broadly the Indo-Pacific. And of course, the core of that is India. There was a huge trade mission planned. We have all kinds of businesses wanting to boost our exports to India. And so this jeopardizes that to such an extent that I kind of ask myself, to what extent does the Trudeau government actually care about relations with India? Or is this more about domestic concerns, right? The domestic concerns of getting reelected, of facing a public inquiry where you're going to be excoriated for your efforts or lack of efforts to push back Chinese interference, and a public inquiry that's now going to expand to focus more squarely on India.
Everything you've just said, Stephen, reminds me of something. I think it was your paper published the next day after the story broke. Maybe it was one of your columnists who said, paying attention to the fact that shortly after he spoke in Parliament, the Prime Minister had said, I don't want to provoke, I don't want to escalate. And the comment or the interpretation was that Trudeau is now tempering his criticism. He's perhaps dialing back the tough stand he took. Do you think that is happening? Is that your opinion as well?
Yes, that is they seem to want to try to limit the damage and not incite protests or further escalation of the conflict with India at the moment. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but in my opinion, much of what's happened so far is a war of words, a couple of diplomats being kicked out, telling people not to go to Canada from India. I find that I don't believe that's going to have any impact. People want to emigrate here. It's an important destination, and Indo-Canadians are a big part of our nation fabric now. So nothing serious has happened yet. Maybe you would disagree with me, but there's been no restrictions on trade, no embargoes, nothing serious yet. So I assume that Mr. Trudeau wants to keep it at this level. I'm not sure what the Indian government's intentions are.
Well, this afternoon, the spokesperson suggested, without saying it categorically, but every single Indian channel has interpreted him to have said that India would like to see a downsizing of the Canadian High Commission because they want parity in terms of size as well as parity in terms of the seniority of representation. And the Indian spokesman said that there are far more Canadian diplomats in India than Indian in Ottawa. But that, to me, sounded as if something they were suggesting rather than they had ordered or requested. But it's been interpreted by Indian channels as, in fact, a demand made by India.
Okay, I should tell you that about an hour ago, we just published another story that our Department of Global Affairs, which is the same as your Ministry of External Affairs, confirmed that it's cutting back staff in India at its diplomatic missions. So I'm not sure if this is intersecting that. They're citing safety concerns. We're hearing anecdotal reports that we didn't put in the story about people just being moved to other countries. So not moved back to Canada, but moved to other countries.
Let me very quickly pick up on two of the points you said, which in a sense explain Trudeau's domestic position, which might have been at the back of his mind when he went public in Parliament. As you said, he faced a lot of criticism recently for his alleged weakness in response to allegations of Chinese interference in Canadian politics. And as you said, there is a major inquiry about to happen on that issue. Do you think he might have sought to compensate for his weakness vis-a-vis China by adopting a very tough stand vis-a-vis India?
I think that he could be doing everything at once. He wants to, it's always challenging for journalists to try to read into the minds of politicians. But the facts are that there's a public inquiry coming that is going to cast his government in a terrible light. Leaving aside India, which CSIS, which our intelligence service doesn't often mention, they have said that China is the foremost aggressor in Canada. It is across the board interference. It's at the municipal level, it's at the provincial level, it's at the federal level, it's in the universities, it's in the businesses. Whereas to my mind, India and Canada's conflict has always been about Khalistan. So I think that he was heading into an inquiry that's going to make him look bad. And now he has a card he can play, which is I stood up to India. And there had been a deliberate effort by the government to try to broaden the scope of the inquiry beyond China, constantly even putting in the terms of reference Russia and Iran. They didn't actually mention India. I should point that out. But now it does change it. There's people saying we should be spending a lot more time on India, even people who perhaps don't understand the issue and understand that it's likely always just related to one narrow issue on the spectrum, which is Khalistan.
The other thing you spoke about briefly was Trudeau's declining popularity and his reaching out for Sikh votes, because there's a fairly sizable Sikh population. I believe it's 770,000. Now,
way more now. That's a few years old, but that's the latest number we have. But there are more Indo-Canadians in Canada in the last couple of years, which would push that number beyond that. Of course, we've also been told that the Hindu population has now surpassing 50%. So the mix is changing.
Now, Mr. Trudeau's government is critically dependent on support from the New Democratic Party and Jagmeet Singh Dhaliwal. And in India, at least, we firmly believe that Mr. Dhaliwal supports the Khalistan referendums that have been happening in different parts of Canada. Yeah. Is Mr. Trudeau therefore seeking to cement Mr. Dhaliwal's support by going public in this way about India?
I hadn't considered that because I think that Mr. Trudeau's biggest concern has to be the voters, not Mr. Singh. He has to be ready to go to the polls anytime, and he wants to raid the NDP votes. So I think that Mr. Singh's support for Khalistan and that issue is Mr. Singh doesn't wear that very publicly anymore after we wrote a series of articles exposing his attendance at Khalistan ridings. I think Mr. Trudeau's primary concern is the next election and raiding votes from the NDP. And so to the extent that he could, for instance, secure a bigger chunk of the Sikh vote, I think that would be his primary concern. Domestically, Mr. Singh's essentially demands for his support are not foreign policy demands. They're purely domestic demands, more social spending.
Stephen Chase, we're coming to the end of this interview, but let me, before I let you go, ask you 3 quick questions. How aware is the Canadian media, and I suppose beyond the media, the Canadian people, about the background of Hardeep Singh Nijjar? We in India are very conscious of the fact that in 1997, he entered Canada on a forged passport. Apparently, his first 2 attempts to obtain Canadian citizenship met with a rejection. In 2016, Interpol issued a red corner notice against him, and in 2020, the Indian Home Ministry officially designated him as a terrorist. How much weightage does your media or your people give to these facts?
Very good question. We've mentioned some of these facts in all our articles, as of other journalists. It has not been treated as the top of the story focus, except in a few pieces in the media. Mr. Nijjar is no poster boy for good behavior, and I think that will come out. That will become more of a focus going forward. So it's noticed, it's mentioned in articles. Some articles have focused on that, but I think that will play out more going ahead. Right now, I think we're in the stage of just the public absorbing what's happened. The next stage will be more analysis and more consideration of what's taking place here. Regardless of his behavior, though, there's no excuse for assassinating somebody. So that's really, I think, where the Canadian public is starting at the moment.
How confident is your government, and I dare say how confident is the Canadian media, that you will get the sort of cooperation in the investigation that you sought from India? I know both Washington and Canberra have called for cooperation from India, but India has rejected Prime Minister Trudeau's allegations. They've called them absurd and motivated. And though today the Indian spokesman did say that if specific information was given, India would help. But at the same time, he also said no specific information has been given. So how confident are you of cooperation from Delhi?
Well, you're asking us only 4 days into the story, but I would say I don't have a lot of confidence. And I don't also have a lot of confidence that our allies are really going to do anything for us, given their other priorities. So I have to say at this point, I would be surprised if India did cooperate.
You really mean that you don't have confidence your allies, by which you mean the Five Eye countries, will be joining you?
What I mean is that everybody else needs India right now as part of their Indo-Pacific policy, as part of countering China, standing up to China, and this is not going to move them from that path. So I feel like we're getting thoughts and prayers from other allies, but we're not getting the kind of, for instance, the kind of support that Canada got when the 2 Michaels, when 2 men, the Canadians, were jailed unjustly in China, and our allies and the Five Eyes stood up squarely behind us. It's certainly not that situation.
And certainly it won't be the same response when Britain came up with the Skripal story that the Russians were in fact using nerve agents on Russians in Britain. Yeah. A lot of countries expelled Russian diplomats. You don't see that happening here.
No, absolutely not. Again, a completely different situation. We're not talking about China or Russia. We're talking about India, which is an important ally for many of our allies.
My very last question, Stephen Chase, and it's one not just the government, but a lot of ordinary Indian people sitting in their homes watching television ask as they find out details about this story. Many in India believe, And to be honest, you hinted at this in your first answer, that behind the cover of free speech and free expression, Canada has for decades given refuge and protection to people who India has accused of terrorist activities, or at least wanting to break up the country by creating Khalistan. One aspect of this is said to be posters which appeared threatening the lives of Indian diplomats. Another are those referendums that are happening. And today, the spokesman actually accused Canada of having become a safe haven for anti-India activists. How would the media and how would the Canadian people respond to this sort of question from India?
Oh, that's a really good question. And I have to say that much of this is generated by this fellow with Six for Justice with his Photoshop. And I don't think people put a lot of stock in that. They just think it's a man with Adobe Photoshop making strange posters. Canadians tend to be isolated and tend not to be well informed about the rest of the world. That is, they don't deeply understand the issue. But one of the things that the media has been frustrated in is that Indian security agents, Indian intelligence, Indian government tells us about all these bad things, but they never show us the evidence. So the response would be, show us the evidence. Where's the evidence that Khalistanis are money laundering and are funding? We never see that. We never see that. So we often see the Indian media quoting the government, but we never see the evidence that would lead us to believe that Khalistanis are a serious threat to India. And we'd be more than happy to take that evidence if they have it.
Stephen Chase, thank you very much indeed. I'm particularly grateful that you got up early in the morning to do this interview, and particularly grateful that you have enlightened us to the fact that there are certain aspects of this we didn't understand, which you as a journalist in Canada who was a co-author of the story that in a sense would have broken before the government had Mr. Trudeau not gone ahead a day earlier, can give us and share with us. Thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.